11 years of being the person in the room whose function was understanding, rather than participation, had produced in Eran a specific quality of presence. The quality of someone who was fully in the room and not primarily visible in the room. The quality of someone whose attention was the primary instrument, and whose expression of the attention was secondary to the attention itself. He had developed this quality across 4 significant postings and 7 diplomatic contexts, and it had served him well in the specific way that qualities that were genuinely suited to functions served the people who had them, not as the performance of the appropriate quality, but as the natural expression of the person the function had found. He was good at being in the room without being the room's center. He was good at listening with the quality of genuine listening, the listening that retained the actual content rather than the listening that was the performance of attention while the listener organized the response. He was good at rendering the actual content accurately, which was the translation function's primary requirement, and which was, in practice, the requirement that translation specialists most frequently failed to fulfill perfectly, because the accurate rendering of the actual content was often in tension with the rendering that would be useful for the party the translation specialist was serving. He had resolved this tension 11 years ago by deciding that the accurate rendering was the only rendering, and that the tension was the tension of translation specialists who were performing the function rather than doing it. The Sorvaine Accord's 3rd formal session had required his assignment for the specific combination of reasons that significant diplomatic contexts generated. The Sorvaine Compact's language was complex in ways that required the specific training he had. The cultural framework was complex in ways that required the specific experience he had. And the 3rd session, Milestone's Sorvaine tradition, was complex in ways that required the specific attention he was capable of. He had read the pre-posting briefing on the 3rd session, Milestone's tradition. The briefing had described the formal presentation of the civilization's significant institutional figures as the ceremony that the Sorvaine tradition designated for the 3rd session Milestone's occasion. The moment at which the diplomatic relationships developing framework was formalized through the mutual presentation of the civilization's significant people. The people whose presence at the ceremony indicated that the civilization was offering its actual institutional substance to the relationship, rather than only its diplomatic surface. The briefing had described the ceremony's protocol in detail. He had read the protocol in detail. He had not found, in the protocol's detail, the specific entry that covered what the princess did at the ceremony's 47th minute, because the specific entry did not exist in the briefing documentation, because the specific thing the princess did had not occurred in the Sorvaine Compact's diplomatic contact history, and therefore had not been included in the pre-posting briefing's protocol documentation. The preparation conversations had been the working conversations of a translation specialist preparing the cultural context for the session's proceedings. The conversations with the Sorvaine delegation's cultural officers, the Sorvaine diplomatic protocol officers, the session's administrative staff. He had been doing these conversations for 3 days before the ceremony, building the specific cultural knowledge the session required. The princess had been at 2 of the preparation conversations. Not because the preparation conversations were the princess's function. They were the working-level conversations, the specialist-to-specialist exchange of technical information about the session's cultural and linguistic requirements. The princess had been at them because the princess was, in the quality he had been observing across 3 days of preparation, the kind of person who was at the working-level conversations, because the working-level conversations were where the actual information was. He had noticed this. He had noticed it with the specific quality of a translation specialist who noticed the difference between people who were at the official conversations and people who were at the working conversations, which was the difference between people who were managing the relationship and people who were in the material. The princess was in the material. She was 24 years old and she was in the working conversations with the quality of someone who had been in the Sorvaine Compact's diplomatic sessions for 4 years, and who had developed, in 4 years, the specific competency of someone who was learning the diplomatic function from its actual substance, rather than from its presentation. They had had 4 conversations across 3 days. The conversations had been specific, the linguistic questions, the cultural framework questions, the specific translation challenges that the session's content would produce. They had been working conversations with the quality of working conversations, efficient, substantive, and productive of the specific information both parties needed. At the ceremony's 47th minute, the princess turned from the formal proceedings. She turned with the quality of someone who had made a decision, not the impulsive quality of someone doing something sudden, the considered quality of someone who had been in the consideration and had arrived at the decision and was in the decision's enactment. She looked at him. She pointed at him. She said in the register that he did not know was the Sorvaine formal declaration register, in the register that every Sorvaine person in the room knew immediately, "I want him to remain at my side." The court went silent. He was in the silence with the quality of someone who was reading the room and was finding the room in a state he did not have the cultural context to fully interpret, the specific silence of a significant institutional space that had encountered something outside its expected course and was in the unexpected thing's presence. He looked at the queen. The queen was looking at her daughter. The queen's expression was not the expression of a sovereign dismissing an unexpected development. He had been in enough significant rooms to know the dismissal expression, the expression of someone who was in an unexpected development, and who was in the process of managing the unexpected development back into the expected course. He had seen this expression in 7 diplomatic contexts, and he knew it with the specific knowledge of someone who translated expressions as fluently as he translated language. The queen's expression was not that. The queen's expression was the expression of someone who was in the unexpected development's presence, and who was in it with the full quality of the person who had governed for 27 years. The 27 years visible in the expression not as age but as depth. The depth of someone who had been in enough significant rooms to know, when a significant room had produced something genuinely significant, rather than apparently significant. She was in the genuinely significant thing. The ceremony concluded. It concluded with the efficiency of a court that concluded ceremonies efficiently regardless of what had occurred in the ceremony, which was the court's machinery doing its function. The formal session's conclusion followed the protocol's conclusion sequence. The delegations moved to the post-session intervals. The Sorvaine court's personnel were in the post-session intervals with the specific quality of the court's personnel in the post-session intervals after something significant had occurred. The ambient of people who were processing the significant thing through the station's social network at the speed of significant information. He was in the joint authority delegation's post-session, gathering with the quality of someone who was in a room where everyone knew that something had happened, and who was the person the something had happened to. Senior diplomatic officer Vel Morin was 51 years old and had been in the joint authority's diplomatic function for 25 years. She had the specific quality of someone who had been in enough significant rooms to process significant developments with the specific efficiency of someone whose professional function required the efficient processing of significant developments. She said to him, "Do you know what register she used?" He said, "No. I know it's not a register I have in my documentation." She said, "It's not in the briefing documentation because it's never been used in the context of a non-Sorvaine individual. It's the formal declaration register, the Sorvaine tradition of the significant personal choice." He said, "The briefing has a section on the significant personal choice declaration." She said, "Yes. The section describes it as the declaration reserved for choices of serious personal consequence. The choices that the Sorvaine tradition treats as the decisions that shape the individual's life and the civilization's fabric. The section notes that the declaration is rare and carries specific institutional weight. He said, and the institutional weight. She said, the institutional weight is that the declaration is not a request. It's not a preference. It's a statement of serious intent that the Sorvaine tradition requires to be taken seriously by the court and by the recipient. He said, and the recipient, she said, is the person who was pointed at. He said, yes. She said, yes. He said, what does taking it seriously mean? She said, the Queen has requested a private meeting with the delegation's senior officers and the translation specialist. He said, the translation specialist. She said, specifically you. Yes. The private meeting was in the Accord Station's diplomatic meeting room. The room the Sorvaine had designated for the private sessions of the diplomatic framework's significant conversations, which was a room with the quality of a space that had been designed for conversations that required the privacy and the weight that the design communicated. The Queen was not at the meeting. The Queen's senior cultural officer was at the meeting, a man of significant age whose function was the communication of the Queen's perspective in the contexts where the Queen's direct presence was not the appropriate form. The senior cultural officer said, Her Majesty the Queen has requested that I provide the joint authority delegation with the full cultural context of what occurred in the ceremony's 47th minute. Senior Officer Morin said, Yes, we would like the full context. The cultural officer said, the Sorvaine formal declaration of significant personal choice is a tradition of the Sorvaine Compact's most ancient cultural practice. It is the declaration that an individual makes when the individual has identified something of rare quality in another person, and has determined that the rare quality is the quality the Sorvaine tradition holds as the foundation of the civilization's significant relationships. He said, What are the significant relationships? The cultural officer said, The Sorvaine tradition identifies the significant relationships as the relationships that are at the civilization's center, the relationships of trust and counsel and genuine partnership that the civilization's leadership requires to be what the civilization's leadership is required to be. He said, The princess identified this quality in me. The cultural officer said, in the preparation conversations. Yes. The princess's observation of the preparation conversations and of you in the preparation conversations produced the assessment that resulted in the declaration. Senior Officer Morin said, What quality did she observe? The cultural officer was quiet for a moment. He said, I will ask Her Highness to provide the account directly. The account is hers to give, he said, and the Queen. The cultural officer said, Her Majesty is in private session. She has asked me to communicate the following. The declaration has been made. The tradition requires the declaration to be treated with the seriousness it carries. The Queen is not dismissing the declaration. The Queen is in the process of understanding the declaration's basis before determining her response. He said, the Queen's response. The cultural officer said, the declaration tradition requires the Queen's acknowledgement for the declaration to proceed to its next stage. The declaration tradition also permits the Queen's inquiry before the acknowledgement, the inquiry into the declaration's basis, the quality identified, the circumstances of the identification. Senior Officer Morin said, and the inquiry is what the Queen is conducting. The cultural officer said, yes. The Queen is requesting time to conduct the inquiry before the acknowledgement. The joint authority delegation is asked to remain at the station for the inquiry's duration. He said, how long? The cultural officer said, the inquiry is not constrained by time. It proceeds at the pace the inquiry requires. He said, yes. He said it in the register of someone who was in a significant thing, and who was in it with the quality of someone who gave significant things the full quality of their attention. He thought, 11 years of the function, 7 diplomatic contexts, the accurate rendering of the actual content. He thought, the room's silence at the 47th minute. He thought, the Queen's expression. He thought, I don't know what is happening. I know that it is significant and that it is happening and that the inquiry will tell me what I need to know to be in it correctly. He said to Senior Officer Morin after the cultural officer had left, "I want to speak with the princess," she said. "The cultural officer can arrange it," he said. "I want to speak with her before the Queen's inquiry concludes, before the institutional weight of the acknowledgement question is the primary context." She said, "Yes," he said. "I want to understand what she observed, not what the tradition means, what she observed in the preparation conversations that produced the declaration." She said, "Yes, I'll arrange it." The princess was in the Accord Station's secondary observation room when he arrived. The room with the viewport that faced the frontier zone's outer systems rather than the station's operational spaces. The room that was used for the conversations that were not the official conversations, but which were the conversations that required the quality the official conversation spaces didn't provide. She had chosen the room. He noticed this. She was 24 years old and she was in the room with the quality of someone who was in the position they had chosen for the specific reason of having chosen it, which was the quality of a person who understood that the context of a conversation shaped the conversation and who had selected the context accordingly. He said, "I want to understand what you observed in the preparation conversations." She said, "Yes, I want to tell you," he said. "I'm asking because I want to understand the declaration's basis before the institutional context of the acknowledgement question becomes the primary frame. I want to understand what you actually saw rather than what the tradition's weight adds to the seeing." She said, "Yes, that's the right order." He said, "Yes." She said, "The first preparation conversation. Day 1, the session preparation's morning interval. You were in the linguistic documentation with the Sorvaine cultural protocol officer. The specific translation challenges in the third session milestones ceremonial language." He said, "Yes. The honorific systems application to the joint authorities personnel in the Sorvaine traditional forms." She said, "The cultural protocol officer was providing the honorific systems application in the form that was most favorable to the Sorvaine Compact's presentation of its institutional hierarchy." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you noted not for the record in the working conversation that the application the officer was providing would produce a rendering of the joint authority delegation's senior officer as a subordinate figure in the Sorvaine ceremonial language, rather than as the equivalent rank figure the diplomatic relationship required." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you said so." He said, "An inaccurate honorific rendering in the ceremonial context would have produced a formal impression of the joint authority delegation that the joint authority delegation had not agreed to, and that would have undermined the ceremony's function." She said, "Yes, I know. What I observed was that you said so." He said, "It was the accurate observation. The function required the accurate observation." She said, "The cultural protocol officer had been performing the honorific systems application in the form most favorable to the Sorvaine Compact's institutional presentation for 4 years of the diplomatic contact. I know this. The other translation specialists in the prior sessions noted the same thing you noted and did not say so." He said, "I don't know what the other translation specialists did." She said, "I do. I've been in the diplomatic sessions for 4 years. The other specialists noted the issue and produced the honorific rendering that the officer was providing, because the officer was the Sorvaine Compact's cultural protocol officer, and the correction of the officer's rendering was the kind of friction that translation specialists in significant diplomatic contexts typically avoid producing." He said, "The friction of correcting the rendering is less significant than the friction of the inaccurate rendering's consequences." She said, "Yes, I know that. That's the accurate assessment of the cost-benefit calculation." The translation specialists who didn't correct the rendering also knew that. They made a different calculation, he said, a short-term friction avoidance calculation. She said, "Yes," he said. "The short-term friction avoidance calculation is the wrong calculation in significant diplomatic contexts because the accumulated wrong calculations produce the relationship that is not what either party intended. She said, "Yes. I know that too," he said. "Then I don't understand what you observed. I made the accurate calculation, that's the function." She said, "I observed you not finding it difficult," he said. "Not finding what difficult?" She said, "The correction, the friction. The moment when you said to the cultural protocol officer, in the working conversation, not the official session, that the rendering needed adjustment." He said, "It wasn't difficult." She said, "Yes. That's what I observed," he said. "I don't understand the significance of it not being difficult." She said, "The translation specialists who didn't correct the rendering, it was difficult for them. Not in the obvious way. In the specific way of people who are making the calculation between the accurate thing and the useful thing, and who are in the calculation's friction. The friction was visible," he said, "and with me." She said, "There was no calculation. You saw the inaccurate rendering, and you said it was inaccurate. The friction wasn't present because the calculation wasn't present because the accurate thing was simply the thing, and there wasn't a competing option in your processing." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The second conversation." She said, "The second preparation conversation, day 2, afternoon interval. The Sorvaine tradition's account of the third session milestone significance. You were asking the cultural documentation officer about the tradition's origin period." He said, "Yes. The linguistic documentation required the specific historical register of the tradition's origin period because the ceremonial language draws from the origin period's forms." She said, "And the cultural documentation officer was providing the origin period's account in the tradition's ceremonial register." He said, "The ceremonial register was not the register I needed for the linguistic documentation. I needed the historical records register, the accurate account rather than the traditional account." She said, "Yes. And you asked for the distinction." He said, "The ceremonial register and the historical register in the Sorvaine tradition have specific differences in the honorific structures that matter for the linguistic documentation." She said, "I know. What I observed was that you asked for the distinction in the specific way of someone who understood that the two registers existed, and who was not satisfied with the ceremonial register as the substitute for the historical record." He said, "The ceremonial register is not the historical record." She said, "No, it isn't. In 4 years of the diplomatic contact, the joint authorities personnel have received the Sorvaine tradition's account in the ceremonial register. The ceremonial register is the register the Sorvaine Compact's diplomatic function provides by default." He said, "Because the ceremonial register is the presentation." She said, "Yes. The presentation of the tradition rather than the tradition." He said, "The linguistic documentation required the tradition rather than the presentation." She said, "Yes. And you asked for it," he said. "It was the function's requirement." She said, "Yes. And the previous 4 years of translation specialists also had the function's requirement. They received the ceremonial register." He said, "Because they didn't know to ask for the distinction." She said, "Because they were satisfied with the presentation." You were not satisfied with the presentation. Not because you were being difficult, because the presentation wasn't what you needed and you said so. He said, "The presentation of the tradition is not the same as the tradition. In linguistic documentation, the distinction matters." She said, "Yes, I know." She said, "The third conversation, day 3 morning." He said, "The session's formal ceremonial language review." She said, "The formal review produced the complete translation framework for the session. You produced the translation framework with the specific quality I had been observing in the 2 prior conversations, which was the quality of the accurate rendering rather than the useful rendering." He said, "The useful rendering is not a different function from the accurate rendering. The accurate rendering is the most useful rendering." She said, "Yes, I know that, and you know that. And I've been in 4 years of the diplomatic sessions watching translation specialists who know that and who produce something other than that." He said, "Yes." she said. And the fourth conversation, he said. The fourth conversation was the afternoon of day 3, the session's final preparation. She said, yes. At the fourth conversation's end, when the preparation work was complete, you asked me a question, he said. I asked you if there was anything in the ceremonial language's structure that the historical documentation differed from significantly enough to affect the rendering. She said, yes, he said. Because I had found 3 places in the third conversation's review where the ceremonial language's structure suggested a historical form that the documentation hadn't provided, and I wanted to know if the historical form was relevant to the rendering. She said, yes, he said. And you provided the historical forms. She said, yes. I provided them, he said. They were relevant to the rendering. She said, yes. She said, I want to tell you what I observed in the fourth conversation's question, he said. Yes, she said. You had completed the function. The preparation work was complete. The session's translation framework was ready. You asked the additional question not because the function's completion required it, but because the function's accuracy might benefit from it. He said, the function's accuracy is the function. She said, yes. The function's completion and the function's accuracy are not the same thing. The completion is the deliverable. The accuracy is the standard. The translation specialists who complete the function at the completion produce the deliverable at the standard the completion requires. You completed the function at the accuracy standard. The accuracy standard required the additional question. He said, yes, she said, and that's not the significant thing I observed. He said, what is? She said, the additional question was addressed to me. He said, you were the person who had the information the question required. She said, I was the princess. In the preparation conversation context, the appropriate person to ask for additional historical documentation was the cultural documentation officer, who was the function's designated information source. He said, the cultural documentation officer's documentation on the historical forms was the ceremonial register's documentation. You had provided the historical register in the third conversation. The additional question required the historical register's information. She said, yes, and I had that information and you asked me because I had it. He said, yes. She said, not because I was the princess. He said, no. The princess's function in the preparation conversations was the function you were performing, which was the documentation preparation. The additional question was in the domain of the function you were performing. You had the relevant information. She said, yes, she said. You asked me as the person who had the information rather than as the princess whose position required the formal address. He said, I asked you the question required asking. She said, yes, he said. The princess's position didn't change the question. She said, no, it didn't, he said. I don't understand why that's significant. She said, in the 4 years of the diplomatic contact, the joint authorities personnel have addressed me in the context of my position first and my function second. The person whose position is the princess is the person they're addressing. The function is the secondary attribute, he said. But in the preparation conversations, your function was the relevant attribute. She said, yes, he said. Your position was not the relevant attribute for the function. She said, no, he said, and the question was in the domain of the function. She said, yes. So you asked the function. He said, yes. She said, not the princess. He said, I asked the person who had the information. She said, yes. She said, that's the significant thing, he said, that I asked the person who had the information. She said, that you asked the person, not the position. The person who had the information, who happened to also be the princess, but who you were addressing as the person with the information. He said, I don't find that unusual. The function determines the relevant attribute in the working conversation. She said, yes, I know, and that's the significant thing, he said, the not finding it unusual. She said, yes, he said, I'm observing a pattern. She said, yes, he said. The significant things you observed were not the significant things themselves. She said, no, he said. They were the not finding them difficult. She said, yes, he said. The not calculating between the accurate thing and the useful thing. She said, yes. He said, the not being satisfied with the presentation rather than the tradition. She said, yes, he said, and the not addressing the position rather than the person. She said, yes, he said. The significant things were the absences. She said, yes, he said. The absent calculations, the absent friction, the absent satisfaction with the presentation, the absent position addressing. She said, yes. He said, you made a formal declaration of significant personal choice based on what I was not doing. She said, yes. He said, he found the word unusual. She said, the Sorvaine tradition holds that what people don't do is more informative than what they do. What people do is the product of their calculation. What people don't do is the product of their character. He said, the absences are the character. She said, yes. He said, and my character's absences, she said, are the character I was looking for. He said, what were you looking for? She said, I want to tell you about the Sorvaine compact's specific quality. He said, yes. She said, the compact's leadership tradition, the tradition that governs the people at the civilization center, has a specific quality it looks for. Not capability. Capability is common. Not ambition. Ambition is very common. The specific quality is rare. He said, what is the quality? She said, the quality of someone who is at the center without wanting to be at the center. The quality of someone who does the function because the function is the thing, and not because the function is the vehicle for something the function can provide. The quality of someone whose engagement with what is in front of them is the engagement itself rather than the engagement as the means to the end. He said, and that's what the absences indicate. She said, the absences indicate that there is no alternative calculation. The person who doesn't calculate between the accurate thing and the useful thing is the person for whom the accurate thing is simply the thing, and the useful thing is a category that doesn't arise in the calculation, because the calculation doesn't have that variable. He said, I render what is said. That's the function. She said, yes. And the person who renders what is said because that's the function is not the same person as the person who renders what is said because the accurate rendering.